very happy that you're all able to join us tonight. We're going to talk about, the practical implementation of the new balcony law. You know it, most people know it as SB, Senate Bill 323, but now that it's incorporated into Davis-Sterling, you might also hear the reference to it as Civil Code Section 5551. We're happy to take as many questions as we can tonight. Just send your questions over via the chat button on the bottom, and we'll try to address them now, or we can follow up as well. Most of you know us. Our firm opened in 1988, and we've been going strong ever since. The 40 lawyers in our 3 offices down in Orange County and San Diego, and up in Walnut Creek. We specialize in homeowner association law, but 2/3 of us focus exclusively on construction defect claims. And these CD claims, against builders and things are particularly relevant tonight, because a condo association under 10 years old that hasn't already resolved the case might be able to recover from the developer, for the cost of complying with the new balcony law at the inspection and the repairs. And so for those associations, we can help finance that effort, to obtain compensation so that members don't have to dig into their pockets. And so please let us know how we can help yours or those you're managing. If that's in your situation, you can contact Jill or Shelby, or just reply on the chat, and we'll get back to you. For associations that are over 10 years old in Southern California that need help, let us know that too. While we don't do corporate work down there, we have a lot of good contacts with a lot of the law firms in those areas, and some of them may be better suited than others to suit your needs. And at no cost, we're happy to share with you our thoughts, on who you might want to work with, and we can certainly help you transition to that. Obviously, for our Northern California clients, we do corporate help, and we're able to, provide assistance like that as well. So tonight on our call, we've got lawyers with that deep construction experience that's really necessary to understand some of the nuances of SB 323. My partners, Andy Baugh in Walnut Creek, Mike Kennedy from Orange County, and Aaron Zimmerman. And those are doing work, of course, in the side, Orange County, Los Angeles as well. Mike, you've been following this SB 323 long before it was hatched. And so I'd like to start with you. I think most people on the call are probably familiar with the balcony law requirements, but if you can just summarize the main points so we're at least starting from the same place, I think that'd be really great.
Sure. Unfortunately, even though your name's on the door, I got to correct you right out of the gate. SB 323 was the election law. SB 326 is the one that became Civil Code Section 5551.
That was just a test.
Yes. How'd I do?
Go ahead, Mike. Sorry about that.
So there's been a lot of information around about this, and I don't want to be boring and give everybody information they may already have from other sources. But the gist of it is, it's a required inspection of what the statute calls exterior elevated elements. So that's balconies, obviously, but it's not just balconies. It's walkways, stair landings, anything with a walking surface at least 6 feet above the ground that is supported in part by a wood frame structure. So, and it has to be in a building with at least 3 units, and the exterior elevated element has to be something the association maintains as opposed to the member owner of the association. So that right away tells us it's not planned unit developments, it's condominiums, it's not high rises because they're never wood framed. The report that's generated as part of this inspection becomes part of the reserve study. So this is not an all new requirement as much as I see it as a beefing up of the existing reserve study inspection requirement. The inspections has to be conducted by an architect or a licensed structural engineer, and they provide a report to the association with repair recommendations. That report becomes part of the association records for the next 18 years. And the first report is due by January 1st, 2025. The other thing I always like to point out is it's important for boards and managers advising those boards to keep in mind who has what responsibility. So under the statute, it's the board that has to have the inspection conducted, not the association, the board. So that's this board right now, between now and 2025. Then it's the inspector that decides what to look at, how many balconies and walkways they want to see. And then it's the association that has to follow the inspector's recommendations. And that way, it's not just this board right now, it's the association forever into the future, because the first inspections provide a baseline for all the future inspections. And the first inspection is a little bit more involved than the future inspections, in the sense that the first inspection, the inspector comes up with a randomized list of which balconies to see, and then works down that list. And then the next inspection 9 years later picks up with that same randomized list and just keeps going. And the next inspector picks up where the last inspector left off. So eventually the inspectors work their way all the way through that randomized list that's generated as part of the first inspection.
Hey, Mike, what would you say? I mean, there's a lot of stuff online, right? People are doing seminars, lawyers, mostly corporate counsel lawyers are doing stuff on their, seminars or webinars or online material. But some of the stuff I read I don't think it's right. What would you say are the main misconceptions people might have about this new law?
There are three big ones that I've seen in other presentations. One of our competitors was presenting and recommended that associations retain a statistician to decide how many balconies to look at and which balconies to look at. That's absolutely wrong. Do not do that. The statute says that's the inspector that decides how many balconies to look at and which ones to look at. And with discretion comes potential liability. So whoever decided which balconies to look at, if they miss one and that one later falls off the building, you don't want your association to be the one that decided not to look at that balcony. That's the inspector's discretion and potential liability. Don't take it off his plate. Number two is the statute says that it's a visual inspection of the structure and the waterproofing. And I've heard of contractors offering estimates to conduct these inspections, saying, don't worry, it's visual only. We can just walk around and look at the balconies and walkways for a very low price per balcony. But it's not a visual inspection of the balcony. It's a visual inspection of the structure. You have to cut it open and look at the beams and joists and the waterproofing, not just the surface. You got to look at the bones, not the skin. And then the third one is I was co-presenting with a guy, a structural engineer, who said that he has to call out any life safety issues he sees. The statute says if there's a life safety issue related to deterioration of the structure, the inspector has to notify the city or county within 15 days. And he took that to mean if he finds something like the railings are too low or the rise and run of the stairs is not in code compliance. And that's not what the inspection is for. The inspection is to check the structural integrity of these elevated elements, not every life safety issue the inspector can find. So make sure you understand that and ask the inspector about that when you're considering their proposals.
So Aaron, okay, so now let's say directors and managers, they have a sense of the law. What should they be doing now? Like right now?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's a great question. So start, frankly, by calling Berding Weil. Let us help you tap into our deep network of design professionals that we work with on a regular basis and been working with for decades. As Mike just talked about, we all call this the balcony bill, but this contemplates a lot more than just balconies. We're talking about stairways, we're talking about walkways, we're talking about landings. And frankly, there's enough ambiguity in the statute itself that it's not exactly clear all the time what is subject to SB 326. and Mike talked about this and he hit on this, is that we don't want you being signed up for inspection obligations that don't exist. We don't want that scope to be more expansive than it needs to be. We want you to get the information that you need. We want you to comply with your objectives, but we don't want to sign you up for something that is bigger than it needs to be. So one, let Berding Weil help you select the right design professional to work with you. And two, let us help you, along with that design professional, define the scope that is going to be inspected and make sure that the parameters are where they should be. Now, it's January 1, 2025 is when this is due. So we've got 3+ years. But I think that that is actually not as long as it sounds. What you don't want to be is going into 2024 and not having this taken care of. You need to start planning, if not now, really soon, because there are several steps. And if you're going to do this in an efficient manner, in a manner that provides some flexibility, in a manner that provides you the ability to pivot as necessary, you've got to get started now. You don't want to be coming down the stretch in 2024 not having made significant progress and be kind of with all of the rest of the folks that are late. You're going to be paying premium prices with contractors because supply and demand simply dictate that, and you're not going to have as many options. Additionally, I would say start educating your membership. Get them familiar with this issue. This isn't the board's idea. This isn't management's prerogative. This is something that comes straight from Sacramento. It is a mandate. There is no choice here. Let people know that the board and management are messengers. This is not their baby, okay? And so let the people know this is coming down the pipeline. Along those same lines, I think you have to start funding for this. If it's a really small kind of special assessment, or if it's some portion of regular assessments that are allocated specifically toward this issue, I think that's a good idea. You want to start building in some cushion, building in some flexibility right now. On the under 10s, we can help you with that. Berding Weil can help you. Berding Weil can probably get a lot of this done for free for you on those under 10s because it can be folded in and you still have rights relative to a potential construction defect claim. Additionally, part of having Berding Weil involved and part of getting this taken care of early on in the process, or at least making progress, is that you can dip your toe in the water when we first start looking at this issue. So say we go around and we poke a couple of holes in some balconies that don't look so great, right? And we find that we have some problems there. Well, if it's, September of 2024, you don't have a lot of time to deal with this. If we have more time, we can back up. We can say, okay, this is a worst case scenario. We're not creating a report based on these. We're going to repair these balconies. We're going to do a more broad inspection. And ultimately, the report that gets introduced, and mind you, this is part of association records for 18 years. Okay, we want to make sure that all of that process is subject to the attorney-client privilege. That way we can keep things tight. We can keep things just between the board and their attorneys, and this doesn't become part of association records for the next 18 years, and all of the disclosure obligations, potential problems with refinancing, purchases and sales, all of that. And so that's a really, really good reason to be out in front of this and to allow Berding Weil to kind of curate this process.
So Aaron, we got a question, and forgive me, I think it was from Brenda. So can we add these expenses to the reserve study now? And the answer, Brenda, is absolutely yes, and you should. But of course, that means we're going to be talking to the members, getting them in the loop, as Aaron said. And that means we need to have a plan. You can't just tell them, hey, we have this. People, we can't, as you know, as a leader of the association or being a manager, you can't raise a problem and not have a solution at the same time. But Aaron, the question strikes me though, and Mike mentioned it as well. What would you say the difference is between the normal reserve study and the assumptions that come with that compared to the new balcony inspections under 326?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's probably where Brenda was going, and we actually get this all the time, and there's at least two parts to it. One is because this law is so new and because it was relatively unknown to so many people in the industry, existing reserve studies don't contemplate the inspection process. It's just not funded for. And so that is what we would call an extraordinary expense. It has not been reserved for, and it's going to have to come out of something. It's going to come out of reserves ultimately. More importantly, those reserve studies, as many of you managers know who have done this for a while, those do not contemplate defects. Those are built in a vacuum. That is when everything is running perfectly and balconies last for 50 years and no one has to worry about it. As we know, in the real world, that is never the case. You cannot maintain defects. And so inherently, a reserve study does not contemplate these issues. Now, for some of these communities, they're going to do these inspections and they're going to be in relatively good shape, and there's going to be a cost associated, and they're going to be able to incur it and deal with it. For other associations, whether they're 5 years old, whether they're 45 years old, they're going to find significant problems. I hope it's not yours, audience, but it's going to be out there. And for those communities, the reserve study is essentially useless in this scenario. And you're talking about defects that were unplanned for and are going to have to be funded through funds that were frankly never contemplated, were never planned for, and were never assessed of the membership. So that's a huge difference, Steve.
Yeah. Andy, Aaron said something that reminded me, and then I'm looking at Bill's question where he's saying, there's no free lunch from the contractors. And, with your CD background, you've seen a lot of these, but, and I want you to talk about our process and what you see in the beginning when we're doing the investigation for defect cases, how that relates to this. But let's start with this point that Bill raised, that there's no free lunch. I'm worried, one of the things that I'm worried about and expecting is that the design professionals, the architects, and especially the engineers, they're going to include in their contracts these pretty big limitations on their responsibility. And I know you've seen those already when we're hiring experts, to help us in the CD cases or when we get a recovery. So why don't you speak to that, and then talk about, our CD process, how it relates to this.
All right, thanks, Steve. Well, the architects and structural engineers that have to be involved in, selecting which components to test, whether these components qualify as inspectable components, the number of these components to have a 95% satisfaction rate, that they have be able to tell that 95% of those components are performing as the ones that they tested. That puts a tremendous amount of extra liability on these design professionals that are taking this on, and they will try to put in those provisions that will generally be limited to the amount of money that the HOA would pay them for their services. So for example, if you're a structural engineer and you say, I will take this on, I will make these decisions, I will do X, Y, and Z, but my services are going to be about $65,000. If there's a problem that I missed or I didn't get, my liability is limited to that $65,000. That's why we would also recommend, back to Aaron's point, that attorneys get involved with that to be able to review the contract, because you don't want to have, you don't necessarily mean they've got to have $10 million of insurance, coverage, but more than $65,000 of liability is appropriate. But yeah, Bill, I know exactly what you're saying, and unfortunately, we're running into the contractors that are kind of trying to take this on as a cottage industry to get out there, offer the free inspection, and then only do so if you guarantee to do all the repairs through them. So that's a difficult thing. But getting to the other point that Aaron made, I think the thing that Steve would like me to talk about is, can you actually get it for the buildings that you have that are under 10? Can you get these inspections done for free? The answer is, in short, yes. Sometimes, these elevated components are pretty much the most notorious components that you have in a construction defect case that actually make up your construction defect case, whether it be a balcony, whether it be catwalks, whether it be stairwells. They're generally exposed to the elements. They're generally pretty difficult, or you have to be a pretty high standards of craftsmanship to make sure that you get those things waterproof correctly and make them watertight. And starting about the early 80s, the kind of construction practice for wood frame construction in California was, you got a stucco cladded building, wood frame construction underneath. And now the make it so you can't see where the potential defects or issues could be. Well, that's going to increase your investigation costs because you have to open up the walls or the soffits underneath decks or walkways or balconies to be able to see that. But if you're under 10 and there's issues, that's the exact same investigation that we would do if we were going to be investigating a construction defect case. And as you may or may not know, the inspection costs, they've been determined by the court to be part of actual damages of the case. And you can recover those inspection costs that would constitute basically having, the design professional, because we always work with either a structural engineer or an architect. And when we do these investigations for construction defect cases, that they're going to be able to do that investigation for you, and we can get that cost laid over onto the developer if it becomes a claim. So that's the long and the short of what we would be doing. But getting back to the stucco in case, it's much more difficult to do inspections on newer buildings now, because some of you may have buildings that were built in the 70s where they have opened framing underneath the catwalk or a deck. Well, that merely requires, a structural engineer and architect to go up there, maybe put a moisture meter up there, maybe check the wood, whether they can see decay or not, because they get to see right where those joists go into the wall or those attachments go into whatever structural element that it needs to be held up. They can see it. Now, when you put a stucco bathtub around those components, and then you don't put proper ventilations or weeps, then you basically have just created a way that once the water gets into a closed space, it then sits there. And then you're going to have a far more accelerated decay in the wood frame members that are under there. And you potentially can't see it unless you obviously do an inspection where you cut it open and look. There are different types of inspection ways that you can do it. Some of them are less intrusive, where they might use a borescope, which is just a little camera on a tube, which is just requiring to do some, little 1/2-inch holes drilled into the soffit, and you can look up into it. Or they may require you to do much more by actually taking out certain areas of the stucco to see where the components attach into the building. Something that has been our practice, and it's obviously increasing to be our practice, is if they do find the issues that would cause these elevated components to be somewhat red tagged, or there's a defect with them, then you know that when you do the repair, you're going to do 100% of those repairs if they're 100% of those components. So when the repair is done, now you've even been able to have the design professional be able to sign off on it again, that now it is clean. It's now good for another 9 years until you have to do another inspection or what have you. But the other thing we're seeing some of our clients do is, instead of having to just put the stucco up just like it was, they're installing these trap doors that will go all the way across the stud bays. And so, as you can imagine, how much easier it would be not having to hammer out stucco in 9 years or whenever you do the next inspection, versus just taking a screwdriver and unlatching a latch, and then have a little metal panel that drops down and you can see it. And you can see, and they install them right where the inspectable areas would be. So that, although might increase your cost of repair very minimally, in the long run of the building and the performance of the building, it's going to decrease the cost of doing the inspection in the future by a magnitude of a great magnitude of factors. So I think I answered all the questions that you asked me to, Steve, but let me know.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, when you're talking about costs, there is no free lunch in response to a question, that we got. For projects where you can't get the recovery from the developer, it is going to have to be self-funded. An association's not going to be able to make an insurance claim under their own policy for this. So other than going after the developer, you're really looking at, are the reserves adequate, at least initially, to fund the inspections? And if not, then are we going to go to the members to approve special assessments? Or can the board just impose the special assessments as emergencies, when there's a threat to safety? What I'm envisioning these inspectors are going to come back and say is there are going to be some percentage of the balcony structures, the associated waterproofing, the other walking services, some percentage that are going to need to be repaired, let's say within 5 years. So let's call those the A group. And then there are some that, well, they're going to give them a useful life of 5 to 10, the B group. And then maybe there's a C group, 10 to 15. And then maybe there's like an emergency group that needs to be done right away. So if there are emergency repairs, then, the board, everyone on the call knows, the board can impose this emergency assessment. But otherwise, we're going to need to work hard to persuade the members, that they're going to need this funding. My guess is, I know that a lot of us, we say this law is like a real boon, for the inspector industry, but I believe the banks who lend money to associations are ultimately going to be the major beneficiary of this, because there's no association that is funded to make the repairs of the type that these inspectors and the engineers are going to find. It's just the risk for them of not finding things is too high. It's, not being critical of them, but they're going to err on the side of making recommendations for a bigger repair. And there's just nobody that's funded for it because, as we said before, the reserve study is right now predicated on exterior components that we're funding when they wear out and things you can see. Here, we're talking about funding for waterproofing and interior elements, structural elements that you can't see. So that's definitely going to be, I think, a very different scenario.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but my thinking is there are two new line items in the reserve study, the inspection cost and the repair cost, right? And the inspection cost, you got to have an inspector and a contractor. The contractor is the one that opens it up so the inspector can see. And I've been telling people to increase reserve contributions right now just for the inspection cost, get an estimate. Depends on how the balconies are constructed. Is there a piece of siding we pull down, or do we have to cut into stucco, and get an estimate for what it's going to cost for your association, and then increase the reserve contribution right now. Happy budget season, by the way.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think, well, two things, Mike. One is just because there's no line item in the current reserve study does not mean the association cannot use funds and reserves for this purpose. These line items are just guidance, but at the end of the day, the reserve obligation is to address inspection or repair, of common area components. And the second thing is what I'm thinking some people are going to be doing is creating just a placeholder in the next reserve study for replacement, even though we don't yet know what it's going to be. On the cost issue, Rachel asked this question, who will do it for free? Our management company provided a bid of $40,000 per inspection. Nobody's going to do it for free. And if they do, then I think you ought to be concerned about that. Esperanza asked, well, should we wait until the inspectors get a format? So there are people in the industry, and you can reach out to us privately and we'll give you some names, who I think kind of have this down by now, at least in terms of the proposal process, the proposal for the inspection, for getting, and remember, you're going to need not just the professionals, the architect, the engineer, but you're going to need a contractor who's going to be doing the, taking the siding off, drilling into the building using a borescope, doing moisture meter testing, all of those things. And I believe the ones who know what they're doing have the format down. We have in our firm a structural engineer who's also a lawyer, and we worked with her to create a kind of scope of work just based on the statute. And again, if you'd like to take a look at that, just give Jill a ring, and we will get something to you. But I don't think waiting is a good idea because we have so much to do. And the so much to do is not just the testing and the inspections. That process probably going to take 2 or 3 months. But really, it's getting the members to acknowledge, you know, that there are these hidden expenses they're not aware of. I mean, it's not going to be as bad as it was over at these poor people at Surfside, but prepping the members, developing an educational campaign. As Aaron said before, you know, it's the legislature that did this because of some of these horrible, you know, the balcony failures, you know, resulting in death and injury for a couple of our clients, but also, you know, the one in Berkeley that really is the one that initiated it as well. So we have a couple of questions. We have a lot of really good questions. Before I open it up to that, and Mike, I know you and I have been texting right now to address some of these, but Jill, Shelby, I think we had some photos that might be worth putting up here just for a minute before we go into Q&A that kind of illustrate some of the things we've been talking about. So this is that Berkeley project, and look at this picture on your left. They look fantastic, right? I mean, they look new. They're beautiful. The painting looks good, but the picture on the right is what they really looked like. And so much of we see this in our construction defect claims as well. You know, the stucco looks great, and so why should we inspect? Turns out, you know, there's just hidden decay, and that's exactly what happened. Jill, I think we have another illustration of this as well. Andy, this is one of your cases, right? What was this one?
This was in this is in Emeryville, and it is literally you could not see much staining on the stucco, but as you can see on the right picture, once we took the stucco away, there was horrendous decay, and that was a pretty big. I mean, a lot of these balconies all had to be red tagged, and they basically had to be shut down by the city and the county until repairs could be made. And so we actually had to put metal railing kind of a thing to be proactive to make sure members or guests didn't get out on those balconies until the repairs were made. But yeah, it just illustrates the fact that you really don't know what you got until you take a look underneath it. And so
yeah, I think, you know, and the reason that we wanted these pictures up is because, you know, we're expecting you're going to get some pushback from your clients. And, you know, they may say, geez, you know, it's not that bad. And what's the liability risk and all that? Well, if somebody gets hurt, the liability risk is about 100% if they have not done these inspections. This law tees up associations who don't do this, and it sets a standard of care for the inspection and the work that needs to be done. But I mean, if you want, we can share these pictures. You can show them around to your clients, because that picture on the left, the place it doesn't look bad at all. It doesn't look great, but it doesn't look anything like this picture on the right.
Yeah. Well, and going back to my earlier point about, you know, who has liability if the board decides it's too expensive, statute says the board has to have the inspection done. Well, if the board decides to violate the civil code, the board members may not be protected by the business judgment rule and may step outside the coverage of the D&O insurance and may have personal liability. You're not protected by the business judgment rule if you decide to violate the civil code or the governing document. So it was a case about that recently.
Yeah. Mike, what about these questions that I asked you about earlier? Maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, they're good, interesting question. The one about how often do the subsequent inspections have to be done? It's every 9 years forever. So the only exception is new buildings where the building permit was issued after January 1st of 2020. Their first inspection is after 6 years, and then it's 9 years after that. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind about that. First of all, this is part of the reserve study update. You already have an inspection of the buildings themselves every 3 years, and then every 9 years, and that's been on the books for a long time. And then every 9 years, so every third cycle, you get this deeper dive where you have to examine the structure of the balconies.
Yeah.
It's every 9 years forever. And that's another reason to do it early, because the associations that wait till fall 2024, the inspectors and the contractors are all going to be busy and costs are going to go up. And 9 years later in 2033, the same thing happens. And then 9 years later in 2042. So the associations that do the first one a couple of years early are now off cycle from everybody else. And their 9 years comes up before everybody else's 9 years.
Yeah, Mike. So you know what? So Rachel asked this question having to do with enclosed balconies. So we would like to know specifically if enclosed balconies, which are enclosed, should be tested in the same way that hanging balconies do. So, and I'm thinking, Rachel, a hanging balcony, I think she means like something that's cantilevered, that sticks out. But the law is broader than that, isn't it?
It is. It says if an exterior elevated element is anything that extends from the exterior wall of the building and has wood structure that transfers load to the building. So if there are posts at the outboard edge, it's not cantilevered, but still the posts hold up the outboard edge and the inboard edge loads are transferred to the building. So that has to be inspected. The other one we see that's common the last couple of years, especially here in Orange County, are the ones that are partially inside the building, like over the garage or something, and then just 6 inches or a foot sticks out from the exterior wall below. And I think the part that sticks out has to be inspected. The shorthand answer that I always use is if it can fall off while somebody's standing on it, it has to be inspected. Not the whole thing going back to the living room that's over the garage, but the part that can fall off at the end. And what you don't want to do is decide, well, most of it's over the building and only a little piece extends outboard and therefore it doesn't have to be inspected. You don't want the city to come back and say, well, we disagree. We think you were supposed to inspect it and you didn't, and here's your fine, right? So there's some sort of wobblers, confusing ones. The other kind are like little Juliet balconies. And if it's designed for human occupancy, it has to be inspected.
Yeah. Another question I saw earlier, I wanted to cycle back to, had to do with disclosures. We were talking about don't create a problem without having a plan. And I do think that one of the advantages of these condos that are under 10 years old is that if you have the lawyers managing some of this process, obviously in the context of CD, of an SB 800 negotiation and mediation, you can cloak these reports in the attorney-client work product privilege. And you may be able to, unless there's something that's obviously an emergency, but putting that aside, and that's not likely to happen too often. But yeah, to be able to protect it from disclosure gives the board some breathing room in terms of developing a plan, whether that plan is funding or whether it is, working through the SB 800 mediation process, to get the funds so that members won't have to pay or won't have to pay all of it. I think that's an important piece of it. Unfortunately, for the projects that are over 10, it may not be quite as easy to keep that cloaked, but certainly information gathered in connection with preparation of a claim will give a board a lot more flexibility to do that.
Right. That's why that first dip your toe in the water and look at a few balconies is so important, because that's not your official report yet, whether you can keep attorney-client privilege on it or not. Once you commit to this report's going to be our official report in association records, and nobody's ever opened the balconies before in the building, whether it's 5 years old or 45 years old, we don't know what your report's going to say. And if you've committed to putting in an association record sight unseen, and it says the balconies and walkways are bad, that's an association record for 18 years. Every prospective purchaser is going to get a copy, and that's going to affect property values pretty significantly.
Mike, I want to make sure we nail the answer here, because Rachel says, so if it does not stick out and no one can fall out, it should not be inspected? And I don't think that's correct.
If it extends from the exterior wall of the building is the statutory language. So I've got a case right now where there's garages below and a balcony, a patio directly above the garage off the master bedroom of most of the unit types. And only a little lip sticks out. And, and it goes back 15 feet where you can go out and have breakfast or whatever. The lip that sticks out, I think, has to be inspected. If it's completely flush with the exterior wall of the building, totally set back from the outside wall, then I don't think it has to be inspected because it's not an exterior elevated element that extends from the exterior wall of the building. So,
Mike, what about those buildings that have like the balconies are inserted? They have little cutouts into the building, and so they're attached on three sides. They don't technically stick out to what you would believe the face is, but aren't those cutouts still considered off the face of the building and then would be inspectable if they're over like another deck below?
yeah, if it's like stacked units and you have columns at the outside holding everything up, and you've got balconies up and up and up, then the exterior wall of the building is back where the sliding glass door into the living room is, right? It's not the outside edge of all the stack of balconies.
Hey,
Right.
but
I'm thinking,
But Mike, who's making that decision? I mean, earlier, one of the things you said right in the beginning is stay in your lane, right? The board has a role, the inspector has a role, the destructive testing GT contractor has a role. Who's deciding these questions? And before you answer that, let me throw in a little ringer here. What about the waterproofing component, the flashing? Okay, that may not be sticking out.
right. Well, that's true. I mean, it says an exterior elevated element is the wood structure and associated waterproofing system. So the kind of balcony where, 18 inches sticks out and the rest of it's back over the garage, that's all one membrane that goes all the way back. And the edge flashing goes all the way back, and the leak could be back over here somewhere. So the associated waterproofing system needs to be examined. But the part that's, completely over the garage, the floor joists that are in the garage ceiling, I don't think are part of the inspection. But the waterproofing does, because the leak could originate somewhere else. We've all seen the water travel horizontally.
So this is a nuance. And this is not a thing we want directors or managers to deciding.
Right.
So they put the ball in play. Who's making the decisions on this?
If I were the manager advising the board, I would say let the inspector make that determination. The statute is ultimately silent on all these nuances because I don't think the legislators thought about it. The other kind that's going to be a wobbler is we've got cases right now. Andy, I'm thinking of a case of yours in San Ramon where they all have Juliet balconies. Some of them are wrought iron and some of them are wood framed, right? You got to look at the wood framed ones, even though the deck's only that wide, if it's designed for human occupancy. Who's going to come along and say, association, you should have inspected that kind and you didn't because you didn't think you needed to? That's probably going to be the municipality. And we don't know how they're going to enforce it yet because they don't even have this on their radar yet. And each municipality is going to be different. So the city of San Ramon may take one approach and the city of Los Angeles or Long Beach takes a different approach. And so I would put those wavering determinations on the inspector with input from council.
Well,
But,
I was going to say two things. First, hearkening back to what Zimmerman said earlier on when Aaron said, get the lawyers involved. I mean, there really is a reason to have the lawyers help negotiate the scopes of work here to really protect the board to the greatest degree possible. But secondly, for those of us who may not be up on our Shakespeare the way you seem to be, what is a Juliet balcony?
That's the one where Juliet goes out where Romeo sings to her. Those are the little balconies. It's not a full-on balcony where you go out and have your coffee in the morning, but a little one off of, a bedroom that looks nice that you don't actually go out on very often. Maybe you have a couple of plants out there. So the little tiny balcony, The smallest kind are really like, to put, plants out there and you'd never actually go out there. It's bigger than a flower box outside the window, but some of them are designed for human occupancy with a walking surface and wood framing. And if it can fall off the building while somebody's standing out there, it has to be inspected.
The the San Ramon one that you were talking about, the case, those are actually just decorative Juliets on the side, so they're not meant for human walking paths. But I have had a case in a couple years back that had these awnings that were over all these doors. They were decorative awnings, but they ended up having a couple of them actually failed and dropped. But those aren't inspectable because people don't get on them, right?
Yeah. Well, your San Ramon one, they're only about that wide, but there's a sliding glass door that opens out onto them. I would say, to be on the safe side, I would call those. I mean, maybe the plans and permits give us some.
Well, we have inspected a bunch of them anyway, so we're happy to sign off on it with the people. But I see what you mean.
Yeah, I want to jump in here real quick too, just to piggyback on this before it runs its course. And Mike, I fully agree with your assessment of what is actually subject to the inspection requirements in those balconies that kind of had different characteristics. And I think we're seeing a lot more of those. We're seeing developers and architects and designers get a little bit more creative in how they set these up. And there's more requirements from municipalities to create these open spaces in the planning phase of these projects. But I think it's important to note is that ultimately we love to argue about this. We love to pick it apart, but it is going to be the design professional at the end of the day who stamps the inspection. It's ultimately going to be up to them what they feel they have to inspect. And all the more reason for Berding Weil to be involved up front to make sure we're not halfway through this process and the design professional later on, and no disrespect to anyone in that field, they have to do what they have to do and they have a different risk than we do. But we need to make sure we define those inspection parameters, before the association is actually shelling out money. And we don't want to bite off more than we can chew. I think there is a little bit of an inherent conflict there between the lawyers and the design professionals. We all want the clients to be safe. We want their buildings to be correct and proper and watertight. But I think the lawyers, we don't want to do a whole lot more in terms of inspection and investment on the part of our clients than we really need to.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's the same for the design professionals who actually do have to stamp, that approval, if you will.
Yeah, and there are going to be a lot of weird judgment call ones. The one that's back over the garage, mostly you see a lot of those in Southern California. They market them as an outdoor living room or whatever. There's a TV out there, and that's a common feature in newer projects we're seeing a lot of down here.
Let's see, I'm thinking I think we've answered just about all the questions. Oh, someone asked a question about the cost. The cost is going to vary based on.
Yeah, I just sent the answer to her, but yeah, I just said that it's going to vary based on they said they have a 1984 building and it has 75 units, and it's going to depend on how the number of building components that need to be inspected and whether there is an access issue to how you're going to get to those components. So, I mean, I can tell you that, if it was I think it's just going to be too many variables to be able to give you an estimate based on, just that information. But that's where Mike was talking about earlier, is it would be good to get that estimate out there, to get someone to come out and say, I'll give you an estimate what we think it's going to cost to inspect them. So at least you have that in your budget, and then you can, put that in your reserves and start, budgeting for it. But just too many variables.
I think that's right. But let me ask you this: Would any of you guys, Andy, Aaron, Mike, would you guys blanch if we said, well, depending on, is it concrete on the balcony? What's the facing? Did the owners abuse the balcony by putting that crazy AstroTurf stuff on it? All that stuff. I'm thinking it's something like $1,000 to $2,500 a balcony. Does that offend anybody as being outside the realm?
No, but that's in the middle of a humongous range, right? So sure. The stucco soffit, lightweight concrete on top, everything's all encased in concrete, hiding the wood and the waterproofing is going to be the most expensive. And then you're going to have some that are just open joist bays where you can just walk around and see most of the components, and that's going to be cheap. And, so access, like Andy mentioned, can we see it with ladders? Do we need lifts? Is it around the back with a bunch of landscaping in the way?
Good point. Yeah, good point.
It's going
The
to be
access issues.
Yeah. And so
if in urban areas where parking is bad, could be that as well. So unfortunately, I would just say to those on the line here, there really is no cookie cutter answer to how much it's going to be. And then we haven't gotten to the $1 million question. Given all the things Bill Lays is writing about, how post Surfside the experts are even more risk averse than they always are. How many balconies are they going to look at? I mean, you may say, well, it's 1,500 a balcony. They're only going to look at 20, or they're going to look at 100. We had there's one expert in Northern California. He says he's going to look at every single one. Now, frankly, I don't think he wants to work, but
I think you hit on an important part of this. Not only, part of the challenge is you have all these variables in the physical construction, but you're going to have a ton of variables in the design professionals that will take this on. Those architects and structural engineers that are busy, have great reputations, I think they're going to be less likely to want to dive into this world, for anything less than a really premium cost. For other people who maybe have just gotten their licenses, they're trying to build up their businesses, they're going to be more aggressive. They're going to be more willing to take a position that is a little bit more or a little bit less supported in terms of how many locations we're inspecting and how invasive we are getting. I mean, I've had a painting company who has told me that they work with an independent architect who will do visual inspections at $150 a balcony if he doesn't see any signs of any wear and tear. And so, I mean, he'll stamp it. What is that actually worth at the end of the day? I don't know. I'd be reluctant to advise any client to get on board with that. But to Mike's point, I think there's just such a tremendous range of possibilities here that anyone who is willing to provide a cost sight unseen, I would say buyer beware.
Two things about that. One is, it reminds me of a construction defect joke, which is if you're trying to get a retired judge to help you settle a construction defect claim, if that judge, if she's really good, you're going to get her for half a day, 6 months from now. If the guy is like a noodle brain, you can get him tomorrow at 1:30.
Right.
And I think it's probably going to be very similar. The other thing, Aaron, is you're not going to get an architect to sign off on a structural component. So, I mean, I know that architects, some of them may think there's an opportunity there, but correct me, you guys on the phone, correct me if I'm wrong. I think this is really going to be more for structural engineers than architects.
Well, here's the thing. The structural engineer should look at the cantilever joists, but the waterproofing isn't his or her area of expertise.
Good point.
So the architect is the one that looks at the waterproofing, and the structural engineer looks at the structure. The statute says either one can do it, but they got to look at both. I really think this is going to be very, very similar to what we do in our construction defect cases. The type of inspection, the type of report, the contractor that cuts it open and then patches it back so it looks nice when they're gone. And so and some of the experts that I've asked about this are scared of it and don't want any part of it. And some of them see it as a whole new line of business, but it's going to be very, very similar to what we're already doing in all of our defect cases.
Yeah. Hey, here's kind of a random question. Somebody asked, is there a fine for non-compliance? Because obviously whoever asked this question is experienced in Davis Sterling, knowing there are fines for all kinds of things like failing to deal with the rental law or records or elections. There's no specific fine here.
Right.
But law really tees up, T-E-E-S, tees up an association that doesn't comply. Because if there is an injury, the plaintiff's lawyer is just going to point to that law, and it will be something called negligence per se, the failure to comply with that statute.
Exactly. The statute says the municipality can recover enforcement costs, but doesn't set up a fine. So, the city of Long Beach could say, well, I want our building inspector to look at every square inch for $500 an hour.
Yeah. Another thing, I think I'm speculating here that we're going to see, but many of the managers on the phone are probably familiar when you get a report from an insurance company or a report from a contractor hired by an insurance company. They've walked the site and they've said, hey, we'll consider renewing you so long as you make these various upgrades, right? Usually maybe it's like a corroded electrical box or improve the fencing, the locks on the fences around the pool. But why wouldn't they throw this in? It's easy, no skin off their back, and reduces their liability payouts by saying, hey, you got to get us your 5551 balcony certification.
Yeah.
I haven't heard a broker say that, but right now, after Surfside and all these fires, these insurance companies are definitely going to be evaluating the risks they're willing to underwrite. And this seems to me to be a perfect, easy out for them to impose it. Ironically, insurance may drive the market more than anything else.
Exactly. And all the more reason to set it up now so that that report is going to say the balconies are fine because you just repaired them. That's another reason why it's so scary to have your first report be sight unseen. We don't know what we're going to find, and that's our official report. Because then you're going to spend the next 9 years explaining, yeah, I know the report is scary, but we fixed it after that. I'm sure you did. That's not what the report says.
Yeah. Well, listen, everybody, we are at 7 o'clock. We want to respect your time and the time of our crack team here. I know we did not address every question, but I know that Jill and Shelby will figure out a way for us to do that. So unless the panelists or Jill or Shelby have anything else to say, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. Hope you found it helpful. Call us if we can help. We're certainly ready to do that.
There is one more question we didn't get to that I want to get to just real quick. Somebody asked, to whom do we submit the report when it's done? City, county, what? The report goes to the reserve analyst to update the reserve study, and it goes in association records. It doesn't automatically go to the city or county unless the inspector thinks there's an imminent life safety issue. Then the inspector turns it into the local municipalities, what the statute says, city or county, within 15 days. And they're going to run out and red tag the balcony. But if it's just a longer term, repair that's needed or everything's fine, the municipality isn't involved. It just goes into the reserve study and into the association records. Yeah, well, one comment leads to another. So if the expert does send a note to the city that the balcony is dangerous, immediately the association has to prevent people from having access to that balcony. Doesn't mean it needs to be fixed immediately, but bracing or something needs to put up to immediately keep people safe from harm. So I hate to end a program on a safety warning like that. I don't know, Jill, you've probably got something better to say.
Well, I was going to say, I'm seeing questions pile up, but you guys, even though we're out of time, reach out directly to me and Shelby with questions, and we will filter them and funnel them and make sure that we're able to point you in a direction to get helped.
Very good.
So thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. Call us if we can help. We hope to see you around in person.
And I'll circulate an email with some additional information tomorrow, guys.
We did record this, so those of you asking for the recording, we will get that to you.
Great.
And one more thing, just kidding. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.